my tremendous pleasure to welcome here today William Marx, who is Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Paris-Nanterre, and who is the author of a large number of books, one of which is the first now to be published in English translation. It's called The History of, it's not called The History of anything, it's called The Hatred of Literature, La haine de la littérature, and it has just been translated into English by Nicolas Elliott, who is here among us, and who will maybe be willing to, at some point, say a few words about translating this book, if you wouldn't mind. So I believe that this is just the first of a number of books by William Marx that will have been translated into English. And so just to give you an idea, he is the author of, among others, Naissance de la critique moderne, la littérature selon Eliot et Valéry, 2002. That must have been a version of your thesis.
Yeah.
So he's also edited a number of volumes, but I'll just say L'adieu à la littérature, histoire d'une dévalorisation du 18e au 20e siècle, published by Minuit in 2005. Vie du lettré, also published by Minuit in 2009, and that book was the winner of the Prix Montyon of the Académie Française in 2010, and that is just an amazing thing because the Prix Montyon was what Flaubert in his correspondence is constantly insisting should be given to him. It's a prize for the promotion of virtue in literature. Now, and so he kept saying that rather than being dragged into court for Madame Bovary, he should instead be awarded the Prix Montyon for having promoted virtue via literature. And I find it hard to believe that Vie du lettré was seen as promoting virtue in that way. I think it must be slightly different.
It's the oldest literary prize in France.
So it's the same prize?
It's the same prize.
Wow.
It's the oldest literary prize. It was founded at the end of the 18th century. And it was the only literary prize in the 19th century. And so actually it has changed a lot. In the 19th century, it was the object of debates between writers. Baudelaire criticized it. But Tocqueville had it with Democracies en Amérique, and so a lot of good writers had it. And then in the 20th century, really it began to lose its prestige, and it is just now. It's just a name of it. It's the same prize. Yeah.
So, but I mean, the thing is that Flaubert obsessively mentions it because of its association with the promotion of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And so is it still
Yeah. I mean,
so you've single-handedly promoted virtue through
I wouldn't have known anything about the Montyon Prize if I hadn't been awarded it. But the fact is that in the 20th century it became a religious prize. And so it was given to Christian books and catechism and so on. It was really not interesting at all. And then, at the end of the 1990s, I'm sorry, I didn't want to tell this story here. I'm not come to it. But it became, the Académie Française started to give the prize to philosophy books and books who have some kind of ethical relationship with life. And so that's in this respect that I had that Vie du lettré, which is something about the ethics of the lettré, of the scholar. So it's for this reason that it was awarded.
Well, so the reason that what prompted me to make a big deal out of this was the three epigraphs from Flaubert in Hatred of Literature. I just thought it's just. You did what Flaubert always wanted to do, but never quite managed. So I thought that was very, very impressive. He really does talk about this prize a lot in his correspondence. So okay, so all right, I'll drop that. But it's very.
I like the idea that Flaubert could be envious.
Yeah, totally. Flaubert would totally be envious.
I did not think that.
And then in 2012, The Tombeau d'Oedipe, pour une tragédie sans tragique, which I believe is in the process of being translated
I think so.
as well, and will come out with Verso. And so in 2015, La haine de la littérature, so now out with Harvard University Press. And I believe that, so this book just came out in January and has already been the object of a great deal of positive notice in the press, a number of extremely positive reviews, and it has also been named Book of the Week by the Times Higher Education Supplement in England and the Chronicle of Higher Education here, and so, and coincidentally, there are piles of them over there available for purchase afterwards. And so, but this is not, so translated by Nicholas Elliott here present. And then, so 2018 also having come out very recently in the last
the
same moment, Un Savoir Gay, which has not yet been translated into English, and which I was hoping that we could also talk about after we had talked about the hatred of literature. So, so basically, it seems to me that that it would be interesting if you could just talk about how you came to write this book and what the basic idea is. And then we can talk about its translation into. I mean, I think an interesting aspect of this is the respective place of literature in America and in France. So the book is mostly about France and England as well.
Yeah.
And there's little.
There are some examples from Italy too, and Germany too, but it's more about European literature. Well, I must thank Maison Française, Columbia University, French department, and Elizabeth Lenson for this very kind invitation to present this this book. I must say, very happy to have now this book translated in English. Well, I think there are there are at least two reasons why I wrote this book. One reason is quite superficial, the other one is deeper. The superficial reason has something to do with recent French political history. If you know a bit about what happened recently in France, you know that when Nicolas Sarkozy was the French president, he launched a kind of attack against La Princesse de Clèves, Princess of Clèves, which is one of the most famous novels of the French literature, a novel of the 17th century written by Madame de Lafayette. And then, Nicolas Sarkozy reiterated many times those attacks against La Princesse de Clèves, and it so is it better like that? Okay. Does it work? Yeah. Okay, so yes, now it works. And maybe okay. And there was a strong reaction from the people, from intellectuals, from students, from teachers. There were public readings of La Princesse de Clèves in the streets, and there was even a film that was made from the movie by Christophe Honoré, and finally, because of Nicolas Sarkozy, Madame de Lafayette was
thanks to
him. She was published in the Bibliothèque de la Pléiade with a volume of her own. So that's great. Also, we must all thank.
There hadn't been one.
No, La Princesse de Clèves was in a collection of novels a violin for a collection of novels of the 17th century. But now she has her own volume.
Madame de Lafayette.
Madame de Lafayette. Madame de Lafayette. And so we must all thank Nicolas Sarkozy. That's it. So it was a great moment in the Nicolas Sarkozy presidency, and then somehow it explains a bit, among other reasons, why he was defeated in 2012, because he was completely separated from the intellectual class in France. And I mean, I think many French people resented this kind of disdain Nicolas Sarkozy had for high culture and literature, which is so traditionally important in France. But now Nicolas Sarkozy has changed his mind about this, and he's the most learned political man in France.
So he's the editor of the play.
Oh, he could have been so he's now he has read everything, every book, and he can talk a lot about. He has an advice about any novel, especially from the 19th century, about end of the parentheses. So that's the superficial reason why I wrote that book, because I thought that there was something interesting here to make a history of that kind of a disdain, criticism against literature as itself, because somehow the attack against the Parti Secret was an interrogation about the position of literature in, as we say in French, culture générale, general culture. I mean, is it necessary to know something about literature just to become a civil servant, for example? And so there was a very interesting debate about this, about the place of literature in the intellectual, cultural formation of a French citizen. So it was interesting to make a history of that whole kind of criticism from, I mean, not only in the modern times, but from antiquity till today. But then the deeper reason I wrote that book is something that is more, that has to do with my own reflection about literature. I was always interested in the discourse about literature, criticism, literary criticism, and the evolution of the idea of literature from the beginnings of it, and we must date those beginnings, of course, but since ancient times. And because I've been always convinced that literature is a kind of a mobile object, and that is always evolving, always transforming. And those discourses about literature tell us something about how it was considered at the time those discourses were produced. And so literary criticism in itself is a very interesting matter to study, and this is what I always did in my research. And then the discourses against literature are a kind of literary criticism. Literary criticism, at their utmost, it's critique. It's a perfect, absolute critique of literature. And it was interesting to study those discourses as testimonies about literature. So I really wanted to make a story of those discourses against, those attacks against literature since the beginning, since the first testimonies of them till today, because I found that there are a lot of them. So, and nobody had, we have talked about that privately, there are a lot of books about books and about the history of books, about book censorship. But there was, my knowledge, nothing about those attacks, those radical attacks against literature. And so I thought that something was missing, and I had to write that book. So those attacks against literature are the real object of this book. I called it the hatred of literature, but actually it's not exactly the hatred of literature is an expression used by Gustave Flaubert himself to qualify the kind of resentment or maybe the kind of reaction he encountered in the French society, in the French bourgeois society of his time, and the way the bourgeois did not recognize the role of literature, the role of writers in the society. And Émile Zola tells how Gustave Flaubert used to sit on his sofa and to say la haine de la littérature, la haine de la littérature, the hatred of literature, as a kind of a mantra.
And then he would add, oh, I wish they would award the Prix Montyon today.
So the irony of history is that somebody who had already the Prix Montyon wrote that book about the hatred of literature. But actually, when the book was published in France in 2015, there was an educational reform in France at the same time, whose aim was to diminish the position of ancient literature, the study of ancient languages, Latin and Greek, and also somehow maybe the study of literature in high schools. And so I was really outraged by that kind of reform, and I thought that maybe the first title I had, which was anti-literature, which is really anti-literature, is really what I studied. I mean, those attacks against literature. But the hatred of literature was something that was more, affirmative, and I thought that would be a good title for the book. But actually, the instances of real hatred against literature. I mean, hatred means wanting the death of your enemy. The real examples of that are quite scarce, actually. And so of course, I tell the story of those real hatred, but they are very rare, and they are most often pathological or parodic, or even for Flaubert, I'm not sure he really experienced hatred of literature himself as a writer, but for him it was very interesting strategically to say that there was a hatred of literature in the society, in the bourgeois society, so he could position literature as a kind of an autonomous power against society, separated from society. So I think that in Flaubert's mind, the idea of a hatred of literature, maybe he resented that subjectively, but objectively, there was no real hatred. I mean, there was misunderstanding. There were different conceptions of literature, and when you look at the trial of Madame Bovary, I think Procureur Pinard, who was the maître d'œuvre, the one who launched this trial against Madame Bovary, le Procureur Pinard, did not hate literature. He had actually another conception of literature with moral values and so on, but it was not really hatred. Seen from Flaubert's point of view, it could be seen maybe as hatred, but it was not really hatred. It was just quiproquo and different worlds coming together. But for Flaubert and for Zola, it was very interesting to speak of hatred, because it could give that, it could separate society from literature from society, and then position literature as an autonomous power.
Well, so you actually, I mean, in the conclusion, I think it's the last sentence, far worse indeed than the hatred of literature would be indifference. May the gods prevent that day from ever arriving. Well, I hate to be on your parade, but in this country, I mean, that's I couldn't help thinking while reading this, thinking of Frederick Cruz, Frederick C. Cruz, who was started out in the 60s as a psychoanalytically inclined theorist of literature, theorist and critic of literature, and recently, I guess since his retirement from, I think he taught at Berkeley, he taught somewhere in California, since his retirement, at some point he became a vigorous denouncer of psychoanalysis and of Freud, and since his retirement, he's published, I don't know how many books denouncing Freud. And at some point, when I was at the University of Virginia, he came to speak, and I was asked, for reasons I don't quite understand, never quite understood, I was asked to respond to him, and my response was that who knew that psychoanalysis could excite such passion in anyone, but Frederick Cruz is there to, the guy gets up in the morning and starts denouncing Freud over breakfast and then continues denouncing Freud all day long until he finally goes to bed and in order to get up and denounce Freud again the next day, it seems. And so it seems to me that the existence of Frederick Cruz and of publishers willing to publish his books are the most vigorous example of the persistence of importance of psychoanalysis and Freud in our culture. And I mean, in a way, I thought of that with this because literature doesn't really, I think, get too much hatred in this country. Now, pointy-headed elites such as ourselves, yes. Right, yes, people who think that they know better, and so, but literature per se, because literature per se enjoys a complete lack of importance, I believe, in this country. I mean, for instance, it's remarkable to, when I was a student in Paris in the early 80s, I was astonished to discover that on TV every Friday evening there was apostrophe, and since I only ever saw TV every Friday evening because I had dinner with relatives, I thought that every evening on French TV there were people sitting around talking about literature, and which is not quite the case, but even still today there are still talk shows that are, I mean, Christine Angot is all over TV, for instance, and she's not the only one. It seems to me that literature has the leisure to enjoy a certain amount of hatred in, I mean, no American president is ever going to denounce any equivalent, what would be our equivalent of La Princesse de Clèves. I mean, I think there's a bit of gender, I mean, that book in particular, yeah, was targeted for its sort of perceived girliness, I think. But I mean, I can't imagine what the equivalent of La Princesse de Clèves would be, but no one's ever going to bother denouncing it in this country because, first of all, no one's ever going to require that civil servants read it. I mean, for one thing, and for another, I do think that, I don't know, I guess I would, these are my responses to this. I'm wondering what you think about the respective place of literature in the States, because it seems to me to be very different than in France.
A lot of questions. Just to answer first the idea of misogyny of those attacks against Francis, I completely agree with you. Nicolas Sarkozy wouldn't have launched those attacks against Victor Hugo, for instance, or Misérable. But it was
La Rochefoucauld,
but it was against La Princesse de Clèves from Madame de la Fayette. So two women in the title and as the author. And it was also a political, so it was considered as less interesting, less capital, less useful maybe for the civil servants, because it was written by a woman, about a woman, and also because it was a work of Ancien Régime. So that's why it's interesting. So it's La Princesse, so she's an aristocrat. And Nicolas Sarkozy was a president of the French Republic, and he tried to kind of be a populist, talking in the name of the people. So there was also a political idea against behind that. So we could develop that. I want to do that now. The idea that those attacks are better than nothing, than indifference, are really, I completely agree with that. Actually, as I told you, I had the idea of that book during Nicolas Sarkozy presidency, but I wrote it during François Hollande's presidency. And if Nicolas Sarkozy's presidency was a time of hatred, François Hollande was a time of indifference, completely. So when at the end of the book I wrote that sentence, I mean, may the gods prevent the time of indifference to come, I thought actually that time had already come, and it was the time of François Hollande.
Wasn't it? I'm sorry to interrupt, but when Modiano won the Nobel
Yes.
Prize, wasn't the Minister of Culture publicly pointing out that she'd never read any of his books?
Yeah, she was very sincere about this, but we don't ask Ministry of Culture to be sincere about his indifference to literature. So I think, or her indifference to literature, she was a woman, and so it was a bit of a mistake of her. That's one. But there was no real attacks against literature at that during François Hollande presidency, and then came the miracle. If I must comment French politics before commenting the situation in the States, because we had during those elections at the beginning of 2017, we had the most literary debates we ever had in political history. So because you know that Christine, there was François Fillon, who was supposed to be the next president, got evinced because of reviews his wife, had written or not written maybe in the Revue du Monde. So it was the Revue du Monde was implicated in the scandal, the financial scandals in which François Fillon was implicated, and actually one of the reviews was written about one of my books. So actually I was quoted by the Canard enchaîné in that story. So I was part of one of the reasons why François Fillon did not get elected. So and in the end,
another reason to give you the Prix Montyon.
Yeah, but it was in advance, so it was a prize by anticipation, and then Christine Angot launched an attack on TV against François Fillon, and that was a great moment of television, I would say, and then we had this new president, which is the most literary person.
Yes, he married his French teacher.
Yeah, yes, his French teacher, literature.
Literally married his French teacher.
And so since François Mitterrand, he was a philosopher, he was a secretary of Paul Ricoeur. So actually, it's the situation is quite different. So we must be hopeful. Which doesn't mean that he's a good president.
No, but you don't catch Donald Trump being married to his English teacher.
No. So things, well, that's a message of hope for Americans. I mean, that's after Trump, literary president can come, so can become elected. So
we can hardly find one that's less literary.
No, but Trump. So actually, I can. No,
You think we can find someone who's less literary than Donald Trump?
It's always possible to find someone worse. So that's but.
I think we've been pretty strong in the finding someone.
You are very strong in this. But actually, this book has some new pages. I mean, that were written especially for the American edition.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
So that's And because the editor of Harvard University Press wanted some pages about the American situation of anti-literature discourses against literature. And well, it was quite difficult to find such attacks against literature in America, because there is more indifference than hatred in America, and I did not find real testimonies of hatred against literature in itself. So it's not against specific books, of course, that will be something different. But my object is the attacks against literature in general. I mean, general condemnation of literature as literature, and not condemnation of specific.
Well, so I mean, can we agree that what my Freud example was aiming towards? Can we agree that in order to have vigorous denunciations of something, that thing has to be important enough to bother denouncing?
Yeah.
So in fact, this is testimony to the extreme importance of literature in Europe, in France.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. I mean, there is the real hatred against an enemy that has some power, or an enemy one thinks has some power. So maybe the power is not real, but maybe the power is just, the construction of the imagination. But you cannot hate somebody who you despise, or hatred and the attacks are always against something.
A negative tribute.
So that's why I say that hatred somehow is better than indifference. And hatred, you can't find some testimonies of hatred in the French literary history, and so, and also because in France, the literature was constructed in the social imagination and in the intellectual imagination as kind of an absolute in the 19th century, especially from such writers like Flaubert, Zola, and Mallarmé. And so literature, in some way, replaced religion as kind of a new religion. And this kind of discourse that placed literature at the pinnacle of intellectual activity and cultural activity happened in France, happened also in a different way in England, with cultural criticism by Matthew Arnold, who wanted to put literature as a kind of a new Bible that would be taught to the students. And in America, so it's
in America, the Bible is the new Bible.
The Bible stays the Bible. But you see that, and so I had to find my way to add those pages, because I really did not find real attacks. What I found actually was a kind of a different conception of literature as from the conception we have maybe in Europe or in France, or to be more specific, because there is that great and famous speech by Emerson about the American mind, and that is very important. And what you see that for Emerson, literature can be must be as truthful as the Bible for the citizen. And literature can be a kind of as you say, kind of a new Bible, but not replacing it, but parallel to the Bible. And I thought that maybe it was in this way of the way many, and I talked about those trigger warnings, for example, against, or maybe not real trigger warnings, but the fact that a student here in Colombia was shocked by the story of rapes in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it was a few years ago, and there was a debate in the Columbia Journal and also in the Wall Street journals, and some, because could I mean, Ovid's Metamorphoses be read by students without...
The student wasn't paying attention in the rest of the semester, apparently.
No, maybe...
Rape doesn't start in
no, the story maybe was completely constructed. And I found other example like the fact that some books by, I mean, for example, Tom Sawyer was expurgated from the N word, and so it was the N word was replaced by a slave, which is kind of strange because, well,
But that's not really hatred of literature.
No, that is not. I must say that positively. It is not hatred. It is not even attack against literature. But I wrote about this just because I thought that it was proof of another conception of literature where the people do not. It's my opinion, or the way I see it as a French critique. But the way that some people see literature as something that should be as moral as religious text. Even as when you look at real religious text, there is nothing more immoral than...
Sure, but it's also true, though, that if you can take a work written in the 19th century and expurgate it and change the words of it, then it's not a sacred text.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also just literature as a vehicle for ideas and not...
I understand what you mean, but it's also the way that literature must be adapted to society, and that's something that is very American. I mean, the way
yes,
there must be a conjunction, a complete affinity between communities and society, but communities and literary works, and so that's how, I mean, the whole debate about that happened about the rewriting of canons. For instance,
but I mean, in France, you've never.
But it's not hatred.
But 19th century French writers write all sorts of offensive things. But what you do is you add footnotes, and you can change the words in the text.
And maybe that's a difference between. I would say maybe it's a bit risky to say that, but intellectually risky between Protestant countries and Catholic countries. When you look at Catholic Bibles, they are full of footnotes, but the evangelical or typical Protestant Bible has no footnotes because there must be a direct access from the reader to the sacred text. So the translation itself is adapted to make it accessible to the reader. So that's so maybe it has something to do maybe with different religious traditions. But well, if it must reassure you as people living in America, I found no real testimony of hatred. I found different conception of literature, but it's just maybe more different.
So one thing that I found so interesting, and one of the many interesting things that I learned from reading this is about the, I had no idea that C.P. Snow's Two Cultures was required reading at Columbia University. And
yes, it was the first university.
So that, I mean, I knew about C.P. Snow and his Two Cultures, but I learned so much from reading your book about F.R. Leavis's response and everything. Could you just talk a little bit about that episode? It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase "the two cultures" is something that has become a motto of intellectual discourse. I say the two cultures: the literary culture, and on one hand, and scientific culture on the other hand. And it all comes from C.P. Snow's speech at Cambridge in 1959, which was a tremendous success worldwide, except in France, well, for some reason. But when you look carefully at John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was a candidate then for presidency, quoted it, and it became requisite reading in all universities at Columbia first, and for all students, and it lasted. I mean, the success of this text was really remarkable. But when you look closely at the text, it's I found it quite hard to believe that it was so admired and respected, because it is actually very badly written, but that's another problem. But it's also the ideas most ideas in the text are quite bad, and actually it's less a complaint about the division of two cultures than a critique, an attack against literary culture from the point of view of scientific culture, and with a strong, maybe we could talk about, with a strong homophobic view of literary culture, because literary culture is viewed as sterile, perverse.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing. The quotations
are amazing.
112. Yeah. It's quite. I was astonished sorry, I thought it was. That's page 100. No, page 112 is actually your commentary.
Yeah, it is. Oh yeah, it's at the page 61.
It's the tone of scientific culture is, for example, writes C.P. Snow, or intoned C.P. Snow in his lecture, is, for example, steadily heterosexual. And the word is in italics. Are those your italics? Okay.
No, it's
his italics. He said the difference in social manners between Harwell and Hampstead, or as far as that goes between Los Alamos and Greenwich Village, would make an anthropologist blink. About the whole scientific culture, there's an absence, surprising to outsiders, of the feline and oblique, whereas apparently feline and oblique are adjectives that characterize the literary establishment. Sometimes it seems that scientists relish speaking the truth, especially when it is unpleasant. The climate of personal relations is singularly bracing, not to say harsh. So it's incredible the explicit, homophobia and also misogyny. I mean, and homophobia and its accessory misogyny, or maybe its basic misogyny. I was just astonished by this.
Yeah, and actually, and to be just, this passage, this paragraph, was in a text called The Two Cultures, but not the speech, not the Cambridge speech. It was in an article published by C.P. Snow 2 years before.
Oh, there's a...
But and then he censored this paragraph about the heterosexual tone of scientific culture. But then, in the speech itself, he asks scientists about...
remarks that a scientist asked about his reading habits might answer, as a married man, I prefer the garden.
Not simply, I prefer the garden, but as a married man, I prefer the garden. So, and Snow explicitly quotes that as a married man. So for him, it is really important. It is really important. So the answer... I found this just astonishing and wondered. So that made me think that made me wonder about the sort of subterranean links between this book and Un Savoir Gay. But first, if you don't mind, I think that I would like to ask you about that. But first, so I just want to say this book is really beautifully translated. It's really, I would never have, I mean, most books that are translated bear the marks of having been translated. And having worked as a translator myself, I know just how hard it is to avoid. But somehow this does not read as having been translated, and so I was hoping to put Nicholas Elliott on the spot, perhaps inappropriately, and just ask if you have any. I mean, how did you manage to do this? It's really quite a remarkable feat.
Well, I benefited from help on both ends of the food chain, which is to say that the original text, William's text, what we haven't been talking about because we're engaging with the ideas is that he's also a stylist. It's a beautifully written text, and what that means is that it's very, very specific, which makes it hard because you have to get it right, but it also helps a lot because there is a right answer. There is clarity in the words. I mean, I've translated a biography of Flaubert in the past, so I've translated Flaubert's words before, and that can seem very scary, but when you get into it, you see that the choices are so specific, and I find that with William as well, so that helps a lot. And then I have to admit that I also had an incredible copy editor at Harvard, Louise Robbins, who polishes things. But it's that he has a style, and so if you catch the rhythm, and I mean, to be cheesy, the wave of it, that helps a lot.
That's so interesting. Yes, you have a fantastic style in French, but that it can make things more difficult. I mean, that...
Of course, I mean, hearing you talk about C.P. Snow made me think about an incredibly difficult passage, which I think is the beginning of the second type of hatred of literature, which is the C.P. Snow passage, where William sets the scene for, I mean, how long is that sentence? I suspect it's 200 words long. It's a full-page sentence where he's setting the scene of this lecture in a hall in Cambridge in 1961, and it's deep into architectural detail, which is something that escapes me completely. But if you get granular with it, there's a lot of French prose that is very loose and that has a lot of extra words that don't belong there. That's not the case with William's prose. If you look closely, you will find that every word means something specific and is there for a reason. And so if you have the patience and the right dictionaries and maybe the right friends and a very kind author who's going to answer your questions when you email him, which isn't always the case, I will add, as a translator, there's a solution there.
Well, I mean, my hat is off to you. You did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
I was really fortunate to have Nicolas as a translator, the one
Yes,
willing
you
to
were.
translate, and actually we so actually, and he found for that famous notorious sentence. I don't know how to say. I mean, Nicolas found a marvelous equivalent in English, so it was great to have such dialogue.
It's really, Ryan's really incredible job. Okay, well, so I would just like to ask you about, so un savoir gay well, it's not, it's really a departure for you in terms of genre as well as subject. But this, I mean, on page, I know it was on page 1. On page 112, you observe, of the hatred of literature, you observe that homophobia and anti-literature are fighting the same fight, basically. And so that made me think that there was a kind of not at all clear continuum between this work and Un Savoir Gay, which is what? How would you characterize this?
Just to finish on the hatred of literature and the question of homophobia in the discourses against literature. What I found interesting in those traces of homophobia in C.P. Snow's speech was the fact that there was a strong continuity between what Snow said in the 20th century and the same homophobic attacks against literature at the end of the 15th century or in the 16th century. And so what I found quite strange and weird was the fact that there was that continuity of homophobia, of homophobic arguments against literature, based actually on Ovid. And because Ovid says that Orpheus was at the same time the first poet and also the inventor of same-sex love. So after he lost Eurydice. So there is a mythological reason behind that homophobia. But the fact that there is that continuity between the end of the Middle Ages and the 20th century in these arguments, we can find those arguments in the 17th century, in the 18th century. And although literature in the same period had changed a lot, so it was not the same literature, but the argument was the same. So, so for me, it was proof that there is a very strong continuity in the arguments against literature, and so and a lot of repetitions, even if literature itself changes. So maybe, and for me, it was proof that anti-literature forms a kind of a system. I mean, with 4 kinds of arguments, specific arguments, general arguments, and this system is a kind of a foundation of, and maybe the real substratum of literature, even if literature itself is changing, is ever changing. So for me, there is a strong relationship between the anti-literature and that is a kind of anti-literature itself, and there is no, and literature is somehow defined by anti-literature, and finds, if there is a continuity in literature, it's not the form of literature, because literary forms, literary status is always changing, but it's the arguments against literature. Those are continuous, and that makes something that
which is also,
maybe,
it's the same as modernity, right?
yeah, it's, somehow. But you can find the same arguments in Plato. Not homophobic arguments in Plato, but something else. So well, that's my theoretical position. I mean, the fact that if we can talk about literature from as a continuity since antiquity to today, it's only because maybe one of the main reasons is those arguments against literature that are real, that mark a real continuity. So, end of the discourse about the hatred of literature. Yes, the Sarkozy is something quite different, or maybe not. Maybe not.
Well, I mean, in terms of form, it's certainly very different.
In terms of form, because it's my first book I ever write that is not about literature itself, even if literature, of course, plays a role in the book, because it plays a role in the life of a gay man. So of course it appears somewhere in the book, but it is not about literature. Maybe the link between the 2 books and between this book about Sarkozy and my other books about literature is the fact that maybe that's the subject of Sarkozy. Sarkozy is a kind of the project happened not after the Nicolas Sarkozy. It was something that was linked with the debate in France about same-sex marriage. You may know that in France in 2012 and 2013, when François Hollande proposed that same-sex marriage, there was a lot of polemic debates and a lot of public demonstrations in Paris, especially with hundreds of thousands of persons marching against same-sex marriage, with a lot of homophobic signs, and it was really terrible. And it lasted for months. And it's for I think for the LGBT people, this kind of demonstration was something new. I mean, for the first time we experienced kind of homophobia in the street proposed by our neighbors, bourgeois neighbors, the same bourgeois maybe that Flaubert describes too. But it was for the first time we could put. I mean, because I did not grow up in the popular place, so I was confronted for the first time to that kind of a political homophobia, and really it made me think, discuss, talk with friends, and I wrote papers in Le Monde about, to take position for same-sex marriage. But for me, it was not enough. I think I could do something more profound, something that could kind of make explicit the difference of feeling somebody like me, as a gay man, have between that could make explicit the kind of difference of experience gay people and LGBT people in general, but gay people because I'm gay, so it's just I can talk more fruitfully about myself and people like myself. But the way this experience is different from the experience from the discourse of the homophobic people who marched in the street. And so I thought I wanted to find a few personal experiences I could have in my life and to show through those experiences how there was a difference of feelings, difference of thinking, and maybe a different knowledge I had of society and of life, because I am gay in a society that is mainly and heterosexual and hetero-centered, because that's the center of the book. I mean, how is it to be kind of a minority as a gay person in a society that is as majority heterosexual and that is not aware of being actually heterosexual, and so where maybe the different sexual orientation is somehow invisible from people outside. So this kind of experience of minority feeling, that plays a role in the way marginal feeling plays a role in the way my mind, and I think the mind of other gay persons and lesbian persons was built. And so the link between this book and the other books about literature is somehow this feeling of being exterior to the society, to being exterior to the object. This is a thing I always had as a gay person. I'm not part of the society. I'm just in the margins. And somehow I have the same scientific or epistemological relationship with my research or usual research object, which is literature. That is, I always try to study literature from the outside, and not always, but most often from the outside. I mean, from discourses about social discourses from people that are not writers or people that are writers. But I find quite interesting to extract myself from the object, from the study object, and to observe it from the outside.
So it's a sort of anthropology of...
Somehow, yeah.
So, it seems to me, so I was just looking up that you mentioned Barthes a couple of times, because it probably would have been impossible not to, but so this book, one of the two of the interesting, the many interesting things about this book are that it is written in the second person, so tu, which is unusual, and also that it's structured, and you address this to a certain extent, but how can I say? Well, I was thinking it would be very different if you say at a certain point it could be written in the third person, it could be written in the first person. If it were written in the first person, it would be very different. It would be, it would
not have happened.
It would, yeah, I would imagine that.
No, because I don't want to talk about myself. I mean, I didn't want to do that, but I had to. I had to because it was the project. It was not a subjective project or a narcissistic project. It was an intellectual project. Mm-hmm. The idea was to find in real concrete experiences the traces of this difference of thought. But I could have done that as a sociologist by investigating the lives of other gay people. But I'm not a sociologist, or I have not the time to do that work, and the only object or subject of study I had was myself. So I had to take myself as an object of experiment, to try to make explicit, to make obvious what is in general not obvious. So I had to talk about myself. But as you know, and well, for me, it was I'm not used to talk about myself. I first tried to write the book in the first person. I wrote 2 or 3 chapters like that, and I found it impossible. I did not want to talk about myself like that. I tried to do that in the third person, with the third person without a name, just he did that and so on. But then it was quite, maybe it would be possible in English, but it would not be possible in French, or it would be very difficult in French. Why? Because I wanted to write an essay, not a narrative. But in French, il is not only for a person, it's also for nouns, objects that are masculine. So there is no it in French. So if I had to use il just to avoid the repetition of a word in the previous sentence, there could be a confusion between the il of the character and the il of the nouns. So the confusion is not possible in English because there is it.
Oh, I see. So if you only said il, yeah, it's like
okay. So that's it. I think it's an interesting grammatical problem I had in writing this. I could also use a fictive character.
You could use an initial.
Initial, but if I use initial, so it's yes, it could be a possibility. I hadn't thought about that. But with a character like that, you expect maybe the reader would have expected something like fiction or the tension, a narrative tension, which I did not want to add because I'm not a novelist. I didn't want to write actually a novel or something. So it would have been another problem. So I thought of Marcus Aurelius. And
as one does.
and you know that in his notebooks and thoughts for himself, he writes the book at the second person, and it's one of the most wonderful books ever written. So I thought that very powerful because it was for me the second person was a way to objectivate myself, to place myself as an object, to make a distance between myself and myself, and to engage into a dialogue with myself. And I really then the writing flowed, maybe too much. So it liberated a lot of things. Maybe things that I shouldn't have said, but I said that because it was made easier by the choice of the second person. And for me, the choice of the second person was heuristic because it had a heuristic value. It helped me to find the facts I wanted to say and to really objectivate myself. But I think it has also a rhetorical value for the reader because it addresses the reader.
Yeah, but I knew it wasn't me.
Yeah.
I knew you were not talking about
No, but I think that at some places, maybe the male reader but maybe even, but is maybe invited to put himself or herself maybe into a
I think probably
position.
himself and more.
Maybe himself, yeah.
The other thing that struck me, and then we can open this up to the audience, but is that your table des matières is also in alphabetical order.
Yeah.
So it's which made me think. This whole project seemed like. Did you have Bach in mind?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
It was my main model.
But also Jeannette did.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to write a systematic theory. Although I had some concepts I want to introduce in the book, concepts that kind of describe just the difference there is between somebody who is in the margins and whose marginality is not recognized by the others. And so I introduce concepts like limes or étrangement taken from the American English estrangement, but I wanted to Frenchify the word, which comes actually from the French. And so, yes, but I didn't want to write a treaty or a treatise about or a handbook about how to be gay, as David Hatteran wrote. For me, it was, I really found the fragmentary form really interesting in Barthes, les fragments d'un discours amoureux. And I found that it was a possibility for the reader to enter in the book through different ways. I mean, he could read the book from the first to the last page, or he could pick the articles that...
Right, marks it out as not a
yeah, but nevertheless, actually, I had to build a kind of a dictionary from the first. So actually, it is in alphabetical order, but the alphabetical order is composed, and it's composed because when I found that an article could not be at that place but should be at elsewhere, I changed just the title of the article. So you can read the book in many ways, but one of the ways is also to read from the first to the last page.
Well, I'm sure that I see that we have.
Well, this is really a question, I mean, because I'm in history and not literature, but I've been thinking about this business of the hatred of literature. But if you think that in some periods, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when the bourgeoisie was very concerned about their young girls and what they were exposed to, and when at that period somehow the novel was really sort of the ultimate product of literature. I mean, I think some people didn't even think that there were other kinds of literature other than the novel. And these bourgeois families really didn't want their girls to read, novels. So that although it's not total hatred against literature, still, I mean, there's a terrible amount. I mean, it was almost, I'm not saying it was the same thing, but with some of these pères de famille, etc., I wonder whether or not they really thought that all literature was suspect. I mean, this is just a question that I'm asking, that I'm raising.
What I found interesting in this history of the attacks against literature, it's that most of those attacks are there to protect children and women. Because children and women were not deemed, especially in the modern time, I mean, since in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, were not deemed to be adult enough or autonomous enough to be able to read correctly the book. So they would be subject to all kinds of misunderstandings, and they could not defend themselves from the perversions you could find in the books. So really, most of those attacks in those centuries are made in the name of children and women. That is of people who are supposed not to be real readers, real autonomous readers. And so it has some, of course, it has a lot to do about the position of women in those societies, and of course the position of children. But even in the name of children and women, Rousseau wanted to prevent the children to read the famous fable of La Fontaine. And so really the argument of the defense of children and women always together, well, because women are kind of children, so is very powerful that time.
It seems to me this is the great irony of the trial of Madame Bovary, is that in fact what happens to her happens because, for the very reason that Flaubert that caused the trial, that is to say, women can't tell fact from fiction, and therefore, if you give them a book, they won't be able to have the requisite distance from it, which is exactly what happens to Emma Bovary. I mean, of course, it was as Flaubert rails in his correspondence in between demands that the Prix Montyon be attributed to him. He's basically her problem is specifically that she can't. It's a demonstration of the argument against it, basically. So yeah, very interesting question.
Not sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have a question about the savoir-faire. Basically, if I remember well, I think the American poet Robert Duncan in the 50s wrote something about the fact that the experience of a gay man and African American would be similar in many ways, and so there's an experience of being in the minority that is similar. However, that thought, I've seen that at a conference in London, for instance, where it did not go very smooth when I raised that topic. I was just wondering if the savoir-faire can be also another kind of knowledge, not necessarily gay. Is there such a thing as the knowledge through the gayness, or can it be comparable to another kind of minority in terms of knowledge?
I very question, and the fact is that I think the experience of a gay man or somebody is very comparable to other experiences made by other minorities. And all kinds of minorities, ethnic, religious, color, or even sexual. I mean, gender minorities. I mean, women. Women are not minorities in the as number, but minorities in the social community. And so
women are underrepresented.
Underrepresented. That's I don't know. I could not find the words. But for example, one of the discoveries I made as a gay person was the dominance of male heterosexuality in the society, the power of male heterosexuality, who actually structures the whole society, and it's something from which I'm felt excluded, and it's my own experience. And when this experience of male heterosexual dominance is also the experience of women, and I had some interesting dialogues with women who read the book and had exactly the same experience. So in this respect, there is a comparison possible comparison between this minority experience and the experience of women, of black people, and so on. There is maybe, and the fact that you are, when Ralph Ellison says that black people are invisible, the invisible man, is also my experience in many ways, in many situations, where I am invisible, not in the same exactly way as black people Ralph Ellison talks about, but I'm invisible because I'm not recognized as what I am. So, but it's different. But there is a similarity.
Oh, yes.
There is a similarity. So there is a comparison possible and some similarities that could work there. And I'm not the one to say that the sexual orientation is maybe the most the most powerful difference there is in society. I do not assert that. I do not think that. I think the social differences, the social differences of classes, are much more important in the way minds are built in an individual. But nevertheless, sexual orientation is something that exists and that plays a role into the construction of a mind of the individual. But maybe there is one difference between the experience of marginality for LGBT people and for other minorities is something that was expressed by Woody Allen in this famous sentence. And maybe I don't know if I phrase it.
It's about not wanting to belong to a club that having as a member?
No, it's another one. It's another one. It's the advantage of a black against a gays is that the black has not to tell his parents that well, I don't know how to say that in English. I don't know what is the
that's right. The black child doesn't have to tell his parents that he's black.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. So I find it quite funny and quite true too. And I think that's a difference is quite important. That is, a gay or a lesbian child discovers himself or herself different from his parents. Other minorities are women found. I mean, they have a mother. That is not a mother, but they are there. I mean, other minorities are part of the community. Black people, Jews, or other. Not gay or lesbian. They grow up in families that are mainly, and that they will keep being so, that are mainly heterosexual, with a mother and a father. And that finding a difference in the family itself, so among the people who are the closest to you, is something that is really, the foundation of the gay experience, in my opinion. And that is something that makes the kind of exteriority I find kind of structuralism for the gay experience.
Yes, it's true. Most forms of alienation you get at school. You discover what you are when you go to school, and whatever it is, get beaten up for it. But here you get the alienation right at home.
That's something very powerful and can be a trauma or a source of trauma.
I mean, it's not the only kind, but in case.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Professor Lathamson's comments on Emma Bovary's reading of novels. I was wondering just about this hatred of literature as a force, within literature itself. Like, because you were talking about how there's, maybe this misogynist overtone to Snow's article, for example. But like, I was thinking about Emma Bovary's novel readings. She's reading Bourdieu de Génie. She's reading, sort of feminine, sentimental novels, which are, not the type of literature that Flaubert is doing. So I was wondering, and that's coming up all the time in modernist writing. There's sort of bad literature that's commercial and sentimental, and then there's real literature, which is not. So I was wondering, what do you think about that? What do you think about that, especially with regard to this question of misogyny? And I was thinking also of Bach and how he's criticizing this little girl, Minou something in the...
Minou Drouet.
Yeah. So there's always this sort of, on the one hand, this within literature itself, it's also, you find the same, sort of...
that when writers talk or write about literature, they are always writing about themselves and about their own definition of literature. And that's why it makes their writings, their speculative or reflexive writings. When literary works talk about literary works, there's also a kind of self-definition that is working, and that happens with Flaubert. I don't want him to make a lesson about Madame Bovary. Elizabeth could do that much better than me. But I think that yes, you're right. There is a kind of a definition of good and bad literature by Flaubert in the novel itself, and that always happens. And writers are not innocent, and especially not Flaubert. Flaubert is not naive or candide. So that's what I said before. I mean, when Flaubert talks about the hatred of literature, it does not mean, it's not maybe a testimony of a real hatred. It is testimony, but it is a testimony of the position he wants to occupy in the society as a kind of the enemy of society. And so so maybe it translates in the bourgeois position what is his own point of view about bourgeois, and his own hatred against bourgeoisie, against the society itself. And so it's a strategical play for making literature a kind of a autonomous thing besides society, that is not in the society, but is hated by society, which is not maybe the truth, but it's a strategical position. But so this hatred is mostly, I think, kind of a fiction, I would say, from Flaubert too. But there are other kinds of hatred that are not fiction, but they are very rare. I mean, some are religious, and
I mean, homophobia is not a fiction.
homophobia is not fiction. But even Snow does not hate literature. He despises it.
He doesn't seem to like homosexuals.
No, he does not like. But and the fact is, when he wrote that homophobic statement against literature, and at the same time, Alan Turing killed himself because he had been imprisoned and punished because of a sexual relationship with men as a scientific. So it was, I mean, the conjunction. I mean, there could be books could be written about homophobia in England in the 50s and 60s.
Books have been written.
Yeah, books have been written. So that's something to do with England too. And but it's this even there there is kind of that is not no real hatred, I think, from Snow. It's reasonable, it's cold, it's full of disdain, and well, that's not true.
Perhaps one more question, and if there isn't one from the audience, I can ask one. Yes.
I'm curious if you speak at all about, the kind of Salman Rushdie paradigm, that kind of dynamic, the fatwa against the writer, all of the
That's
subsequent copies of that move and the reverberations. I mean, it's also an transnational act as well.
Yeah. I did not include that in the book because it is a specific attack against the book, against a writer, and so I did not read that as a general attack against literature. There was no, so far, well, as far as I know, there was no general fatwa against novels, against literature. There was some fatwa from, but it was, I think, in Afghanistan when, or
in Algeria, there was a lot actually.
And it happens sometimes. For example, I give that example, that famous example, the famous bonfire of vanities in Florence, Firenze, at the end of the 15th century by Savonarola. So here in that bonfire of vanities, books from poets, all kinds of books were burned. So that was real hatred against literature. That was hatred for religious reasons. And that for sure, the real hatred comes most often from religious reasons, and Christians, Muslims, and so on. And but you find most often real hatred against books, against specific books, than against general literature, as it said. So if I had written a book about specific attacks about censorship, that would have been a completely different book, and the book would have been much bigger. But fortunately for me, the general attacks against literature are rather, I mean, not rare, but they are less numerous than the attacks against specific books. So it's another kind of problem. But I find it quite interesting, the fact that literature as itself could be attacked and could be condemned. Because it's a way of thinking about that, to making a whole of all kinds of discourses, because we all know, because we read books, that all books are different from the others. So there are books that could please someone and not please the neighbors. But the fact that there is an attack against all those books, that tells something about a special conception of literature, about a conception of society, of man, of humanity. So I found that quite interesting in writing the book to indicate the importance and the significance of those general attacks against literature.
So I bet you have a new project.
I have a lot of new projects. I could not start them because I finished Un Savoir Gay quite recently. It was published just after I had finished it, and then I couldn't start a new book, and I'm just here to making presentations of the books and so on. So the schedule for me is quite full for me, but in a few months I will start.
Thank you so much for coming. I would just like to thank William Marks and also point out again that I think there's some wine over there and some books. So thank you so much.